G'day and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to talk to you about the somewhat controversial topic of whether good posture matters and whether bad posture can cause pain. I want to give you a very respectful, considered and contextual answer behind why posture does matter and why it may have a very tangible and observable link to any aches, pains or injuries you may be experiencing. I think the way that we think about posture and pain in terms of research may speak to potentially a broader lack of perspective that as a medical and healthcare industry, as well as a general public, we may not necessarily have all the context necessary to understand what we're seeing. But at the end of the video, I also want to show you a really simple diagnostic tool that you can do today to help you better understand how your daily shapes and postures might be influencing any of the dysfunction that you may be experiencing yourself. So before we can challenge this view that there isn't a lot of evidence that supports poor posture and pain, we do need to provide a little bit of context around evidence-based practice and how research fits within that. Because one of the biggest issues that I see in healthcare, medicine, and how the general public thinks about research is that for some reason we use research as the sole piece of evidence to support something. And again, as a physiotherapist in a profession that values evidence-based practice, because it serves a valuable purpose in helping to keep people safe, and it helps us better understand what works, it's important that we make a very strong distinction between research and evidence-based practice. And while that may sound strange, because they do appear to be one and the same thing, what often gets lost in this thirst for evidence and showing our research is that evidence-based practice is absolutely research, but it shares equal footing with clinical experience and patient experience to give us the best understanding of what evidence means. So if you have a research paper that suggests that there is no meaningful link between the postures and the shapes that you get into and any pain that you may be experiencing, if that is ultimately correct and the findings of that paper speak to the truth behind that connection, then logically a person's clinical experience and the patient's experience should also find the exact same thing. But the great thing about clinical experience and patient experience is that this has a more real-world application that research cannot. Without going into the full depths of the research method and what it means to research something, one of the main limitations of research in general is its ability or inability to be generalized to a wider population than what the study was conducted on. Where I went to university in Australia to study physiotherapy, when we were taught about the research method, we were educated on an organisation called PEDRO. And for those unaware, PEDRO is an organisation that indexes tens of thousands of physiotherapy relevant research articles, but measures them up against 10 criteria that looks for bias within those studies. And this is obviously really important and something that I would urge everyone to do themselves when reading research, that in order to apply context to the results of a particular study, we first need to understand if there's any inherent biases within that study which might be clouding the results that they're finding. PEDRO uses their PEDRO scale to give each particular study a rating out of 10, with 10 being no biases found and 0 being all biases found. And from this, logically and intuitively, we should expect that every study that we value is a 10 out of 10, where there's no presence of any biases based on PEDRO's criteria. We might settle for a 9 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10, depending on which biases are introduced, and we can make a very logical, measured allowance for those in our thinking and our understanding of what the conclusion means. But one of the really cool things that PEDRO does each year is they essentially provide a summary of how all the studies in their database score. And you may be surprised to know the average PEDRO score is not an 8, 9 or 10 out of 10. It's about a 5 or a 6. And while that may not mean much to you in the broader context of research, what it does suggest is that there is a decent potential for bias in the studies that help shape our thinking about any particular topic, let alone the effects of posture on pain. And I'm absolutely not saying that every study that looks into posture and pain is biased and isn't a good study, but the concept of research and how much we value the conclusion of a research may not give us all the context that we need to be able to generalize the results of that research to me clinically and to you in the real world. And this is one of the important benefits of evidence-based practice being more than just research. We can use clinical experience and your experience as a patient to essentially vet the effectiveness of what a conclusion shows on any particular study. And what that means, as we circle back to what we said before, is that if the study is correct, and even if there are biases in the study, maybe they don't influence the result of that study enough, the results of that study should line up perfectly with what we find clinically and what you find as a person. But for me, clinically as a physiotherapist, and someone who is actively, consistently trying to better understand why my patients are sore in the first place, and ultimately what they need to do to resolve that as best as possible and be free of it forever, the shapes and the positions that you put your tissue in the most do have a very tangible, logical, and valuable connection to pain and dysfunction. But I obviously don't want you to have to trust me on this. But what I do want to do is I hope to explain how I've gotten to this point in my clinical experience, listening to patient feedback, while also respecting what the research says. It's also worth noting there can absolutely be unintentional bias in clinical experience and patient experience as well. It's important to be aware of that, to be mature and realistic enough to understand that that can be possible, but still base everything that we do on results. Because once we discover what the root underlying cause of someone's dysfunction is, once we layer over the top of that the shapes and the positions that they get into the most throughout their day, for most people that is sitting, the location of their dysfunction almost always lines up perfectly with where they lose their good shapes and postures when they're doing the things that they do the most throughout the day. And as we'll circle back to again at the end of the video, the diagnostic tool that I want to show you will hopefully help you better understand why your posture is important, but it will also help you better understand which postures and shapes you might unknowingly be gravitating towards day to day while you're living your life are the ones that you need to pay the most attention to in this unnatural modern world of ours. So once we can appreciate that research is a highly important part of medicine and healthcare, but is not perfect, can be prone to bias, and should only ever be looked at in the context of clinical experience and patient experience, when we look at this controversial topic that certain postures and shapes that you get into may lead you to aches, pains, and injuries down the track, we need to understand a few more things. For me, clinically, I do agree that it is relatively hard to link poor posture with pain. It's not a very good predictive model. And for me, the main reason of this is because we're dealing with pain. You may know that pain is a highly complicated, complex, multi-factor, holistic phenomenon that is inherently different for every single person. And quite honestly, to say that poor posture leads to pain is a far too simplistic thing to say. It doesn't take into account things like tissue robustness, strength, body mechanics, stress, how you sleep, what your diet looks like, genetics, what the rest of your life looks like. All of these things can play a meaningful role in getting your body to the point where your brain and your tissue breaches its tolerance to cope. And as I talk about a lot on this channel, if we understand that pain is just your brain and nervous system's perception of threat, the moment that you dump over that threshold is just the answer to an algorithm that takes into account literally everything and anything that you go through and have been through in your life. So again, it's unreasonable to say that poor posture can predict pain. And I think from a research perspective, this is what a lot of research suggests. You cannot use someone's poor posture, whatever that means for each person, to predict pain for whatever that means for each person. And clinically, I agree. But what I've come to understand clinically is that while poor posture is a terrible predictor of pain, once you are in pain, hindsight is perfectly clear. Again, you just need the right context and the right perspective to understand exactly what's going on with each person. And while I completely agree that some people can legitimately have less than ideal posture for their entire life, they may never get to that point where their posture gets them to the stage with a death by 1,000 cuts that dumps them over the top of that threshold where tissue becomes injured, painful, sore, or dysfunctional. The makeup of their life, their tissue quality, their exercise habits, their positive versus negative balance between the good things that they do with their body and the less good things that they do with their body may never balance out enough where it tips them over the edge. So it's a perfectly reasonable argument to say that while posture may not matter because so many people don't get pain despite objectively having less than great posture. But again, if someone develops pain and their balance shifts enough where they're now above that threshold and something has become damaged, maybe you've bulged a disc, you've irritated a nerve in your neck, maybe you developed costochondritis. Once you've gone above that threshold into the the realm of pain or injury, when we are looking at trying to understand what it is about your life to this point that has led you down into this direction, my clinical experience over 20 years suggests that we cannot permanently fix your dysfunction, or at the very least give you the best chance of feeling the best you possibly can, without having a conversation about how you hold and position your tissue the most during the things that you do the most throughout the day. One of the main reasons why I've come to focus more on sitting posture is that when we look at what you spend the most time doing throughout the day, and we rank them from the thing that you do the most down to the thing that you do the least, sitting is often the theme that binds most of the things that we do throughout the day together. And when we're trying to best understand why one part of your body, whether it's your neck, your shoulders, your back, your hips, whatever it is, has become a problem, we obviously want to pay attention to what you were doing at the time of your injury or pain. But if we're not also looking at what you spend the rest of your day doing with that tissue, then again, we may never get the broader context that helps us better understand why one specific part of your body has failed and not another, or why something simple that you've done 1,000 times before, like bending over to tie up your shoe, or reaching behind you in a car, or throwing a ball, or even getting tackled and hitting the ground. We need to understand why simple things that you may experience frequently is enough to expose a fragility in tissue that should not be fragile. So the next concept that I think is really important to help flesh out our understanding of why posture does matter in terms of pain is that while your posture is a terrible predictor of any future pain or dysfunction in theory, but hindsight is perfectly clear, to suggest that good posture and good mechanics aren't important for healthy function of your tissue suggests that good function is also not important in pain. And one of the perspectives that I think gets lost a lot when talking about good posture, especially sitting posture, is that if we were to take you into any gym across the world and you saw someone doing deadlifts, overhead presses, someone running on a treadmill, there is an inherent understanding when exercising that an up tall, neutral spinal shape is optimal. If you look at someone riding a horse, playing a piano, again, there's an understanding that good posture is not only aesthetically pleasing to the eye, but all good posture is trying to put your tissue back into what we call an anatomical position. This position is universally agreed upon in medical textbooks to be the agreed upon shape that the human body expresses itself best within. And while it is hard to associate bad posture with pain, it's not hard at all to associate bad posture with bad performance. So if we take pain off the table and just look at what allows your body to function the best, putting your tissue in a good posture gives you best access to the function of that tissue. There's obviously a lot of different ways to show you this, but there's two really simple ones that you can do right now just to get a sense of what I mean by this. The first is to just get into a really slouchy posture. Do whatever comes naturally to you. It doesn't matter how good or bad it is, but just relax and see how you feel. From here, if you keep your elbows straight and lift your arms up as high as you can go, then you'll find that you can go a certain distance before you feel like you maybe run into the end of your shoulder function. There's just a hard end point as to where I can't go any higher here. If I force it, it feels uncomfortable. But if we organize you better, we get you to sit up nice and tall, start with your shoulders comfortably back and repeat the same process, then all of a sudden you get access to your indigenous and inherent shoulder range to whatever degree you still have available to you. And it's not to say that being in this position will ever lead to painful shoulders, because again, poor postures are a terrible predictor of pain based on so many different factors. But if you have shoulder pain, and we can observe that you're also spending a lot of your time in this position while you're working overhead, if we then correct your position and take away some of your dysfunction straight away, we're already starting to disprove the idea that posture doesn't matter with pain. Because what we do know categorically, and we can prove this consistently, is that poor postures or a bad anatomical position can be very closely associated with tissue dysfunction or suboptimal performance. And it doesn't take a genius to argue that if you have tissue that is functioning poorly, that's not too big of a leap to suggest that pain could be around the corner. Nothing breaks until it breaks, but once it does break, if we look at the quality of your mechanics, the quality of your postures and shapes, we can then start to see some consistent clues that may help us better explain why you've had that experience. The second thing is we can do the same thing with your breathing. If you were to, again, slouch and relax as best as you feel comfortable, and then try and take as deep a breath as you feel you can. Doesn't matter whether it's through your belly or through your chest. Take note of how much air you feel you can get into your lungs. And then objectively, sit up nice and tall again, shoulders back, and repeat the same process. So for me, and again, please do this yourself so you're not having to trust my experience, but I feel like I can get about 20 to 30% more air volume into my lungs. So if I'm someone who values running or swimming or cycling or something where oxygenation and lung volume is important, or whether you're someone who has COPD or genuine lung problems, one of the lowest hanging fruit that you can improve upon is trying to work on improving the position that your lungs are in. So again, none of this may suggest that being in a bad posture will lead to injury or pain, because again, it's hard to predict. But if you have genuine dysfunction and you aren't looking at the shapes and positions relative to that dysfunction, then you may never get to the root underlying cause of why you have this dysfunction in the first place, or why it's hanging around and not going away. So ultimately, whether you value the connection between the shapes and postures that you get into and the dysfunction that you may have, if your functioning is suboptimal, improving your posture should improve that function. And if by improving that function, you magically feel like your symptoms start to regress as well, evidence in front of you in your experience, as it is for my clinical experience, it's okay if that goes against what potential research may be suggesting if we're looking at it from a different perspective. But if we're consistently stuck in this old school thinking that research rules, and we value that a lot more than we ultimately value a clinician's experience or your own personal experience, then again, we're missing the broader context that may help you better understand what is actually going on. So what I want to do now is I want to show you two very simple diagnostic things that you can do to help you better understand any potential connection between the shapes and the postures that you get into day to day and any pain, injury, dysfunction, or poor performance you may be experiencing as well. So the first diagnostic exercise you can try is, again, simply taking a tennis ball or a lacrosse ball and using that ball to go hunting through your spine for any joint stiffnesses, muscular tightnesses that exist. And whether you have a distinct spinal dysfunction or not, just be aware that your spine is the starting point for a lot of the dysfunction that we accrue over time. As you may have seen on the channel already, whether it's RSI, tennis elbow, golfer's elbow, thoracic outlet syndromes, costochondritis, a lot of hip and groin pain, knee pain, there's so much dysfunction that is a very specific issue that you may have in your arms and legs, but there is some inherent spinal connection that gives that meaning. So as a quick reference point, obviously if you have any spinal dysfunction, go looking through those areas for that dysfunction. But if you have any upper limb dysfunction, check out the top half of your upper back and your neck. If you have any hip or lower leg dysfunction, just go exploring from the middle of your back down towards the top of your pelvis for, again, any joint stiffnesses or muscular tightnesses that may be either creating some havoc with the nerves that supply the areas that you're having a problem with, or being the first link in a rusty mechanical chain that expresses itself down through to the area that you're having a problem. Now, obviously you can do this test in standing or sitting or lying down. Choose the position that you feel is the most comfortable and gives you the best access to doing this particular exercise. But for the purposes of this, we're going to start essentially just looking through the upper back. And again, as always, if we can place the ball just somewhere in the middle of your upper back where the bump is, just let it roll straight off to one side onto the fleshy bit. We just want you to lean back into the wall. What we're looking for is we're not just looking for anything that feels pain or sore. We're ultimately looking for something that feels, again, stiff, tight, hard, restricted, when compared to the other side, which may feel a little bit more supple and a little bit softer. And this is really important because we're taking pain out of the conversation here because, again, it's not a reliable indicator of how good or bad your posture is. But what is a really good indicator are the hidden, accrued areas of stiffnesses and tightnesses that build up based on isolating specific tissues and areas of your body through suboptimal postures and shapes. So for example, if you're right at the base of your neck on one side and you feel like this is particularly stiff and tight, you compare it to the other side and it feels softer. And then you work down a little bit lower, again it feels stiff, but then you come up higher, it doesn't feel as stiff. You should very quickly understand which sections of your spine or your trunk have unknowingly become stiffer, tighter, and harder. And the reason why this is really important is not only can you spend some time on the ball just literally letting that tissue tissue free up. But we can take this information and compare that to our second diagnostic tool to better understand why it's become stiff, tight, and restricted here in the first place. So the second diagnostic tool is understanding what your best posture or position feels like, and then being able to compare that to all the main shapes and positions that you might get dragged into unknowingly the most throughout your day-to-day life. And the way that I like to explain this is if you have a simple chair that you would sit on the most, whether it's your computer chair, your couch, if you can stand in front of that chair, up nice and tall with your shoulders comfortably back. Imagine that someone's grabbed you by the top of the head and they're pulling you straight up. We don't want you to feel like you're resting on anything, but by being up nice and tall, shoulders comfortably back, literally nothing should change. So you should end up in the exact same position that you were in standing. It's just that your hips and knees have bent. So in a perfect world, your best standing posture and your best sitting posture shouldn't be any different because it's the same tissue. Much like if you are deadlifting 100 kilos or swimming 50 meters or walking down a runway as a model, the best aesthetic and functional expression of your tissue should be the same. But here's where it gets interesting. So if you know that this is a great position for you and you bend your elbows to 90 degrees, for example, and your desk is too low, or when you need to use your mouse and keyboard, but they're suddenly too far away. Anything that drags you out of that shape and keeps you there for any meaningful length of time is what we're interested in. And the reason for that is if you know exactly where your stiffer, tighter neck or upper back or lower back dysfunctions were with the ball, then again, because there has to be a reason why one specific part of your body has become stiff, tight, and restricted, the other side maybe isn't as much. When we line up exactly where you found your restrictions and then we overlay the shapes and postures that you get into the most throughout the day, what I find clinically is that where you may be losing your good postures and shapes is exactly where the tension is going for the entire time that you're doing the things that you need to do. So to say to someone that the positions that you're getting into do not have a meaningful influence on pain and injury, if you're just looking at that in isolation, then I agree. It can be hard to mount a meaningful case to support that. But if we take pain off the table and make these logical connections between where your dysfunction is, how you load up those areas day to day, and then bring pain back in over the top at the end of that conversation, clinically for me, this is the main reason why I've come to understand that the postures and the shapes that you get into the most throughout the day, which may not be a true reflection of your posture, but more so the shapes and positions that you get into the most throughout the day. This is by far the most meaningful piece of the puzzle that I think everybody needs to understand to better understand why a specific part of your body has become dysfunctional when it shouldn't. For me, I tend to pick on sitting because that's a lot of what we tend to do. But for other people, it could be standing, bending over a lot of the time. It doesn't matter what you're doing. It does genuinely matter how you're doing it. And after having the benefits of hindsight over the last 20 years, it's at the point now where we need to take a bigger step back and understand that your posture does matter. Whether it matters to you in the context of pain, or it matters to you in the context of better sports performance, or even just improved quality of life and the ability to do your daily activities better, it is genuinely unreasonable to expect to go dysfunction free if you're not giving your body the best chance to do so. So when editing this video, it became clear that I failed to mention one really important part of this conversation. It's also important to mention that it's unreasonable to hold yourself here the entire time actively if you have to be here for long enough. Holding any position for any length of time can be tough. But the nuance to this conversation is that not only do we not want you to be sitting for any huge amounts of time to begin with, if you do have to sit for longer than you feel you can tolerate actively holding this position, whether that's watching a movie, watching TV, driving somewhere, we still need to value the concept of keeping your back in a neutral position. We just need to ask for help from the environment that you're already in. So if you can take a rolled up towel or a cushion and fill the gap that your back would otherwise want to fill if you were to slouch and relax, use that device to fill the gap to make it easier for you to be held into a better position for longer so you can relax and take it easy. So, as always, I genuinely hope that that was helpful and insightful in some way. This conversation is one that I find I'm faced with a lot as a physiotherapist, not necessarily with my patients because they hopefully see the benefits of thinking about this, but more so on an intellectual and academic basis basis on the internet where people are really comfortable, and rightfully so, challenging that idea that posture matters in pain and dysfunction. But at the very least, I hope that the way that I've presented this information seems very reasonable, seems very logical, is very mature, because it can easily become toxic, and it can also be easy to lose focus on what's most important, which is trying to make people feel better. So please let me know in the comments down below, what are your thoughts on this topic? What's your experience been? Does anything that I've said today give you pause for thought if you had thought differently? But as always, thanks again for watching. Please leave a like on the video if you found that it was helpful. Subscribe to the channel if you do like this type of content. But as always, thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you next time.